months ago, I went to see the musical Hadestown. I don't know if you have had a chance to see it, but it is one of the best musicals that I've ever seen. It was about the mythical story of Orpheus, but set to modern times. And if you don't know the story of Orpheus, it's the basis of so many stories that even in our culture contemporarily today, you can see this storyline up here. And I was amazed by this because I've always actually been amazed by these Broadway plays and these musicals because of the fact that there's so much going on and they can tell a complete story using just one stage. And especially in this one that we saw, it was just, there was so much going on, and I really love them. In fact, I'm so excited because I know that as the holidays are right around the corner for us, that once again this year, we're planning on going to see the Nutcracker. And the Nutcracker it's a ballet, but it's the same kind of thing. All of the action happens on one stage, and there's so much going on, and it's so great for me to see this, that no matter if the scene is excited and full of energy, or if the scene is more somber and kind of quiet, everyone is full of energy and they're just running across the stage. Even when the curtain closes, you can see feet running across the stage, and there's just so much energy, and you really get to notice and understand that what you see on the stage is not everything that's happening. That there's a lot more going on behind the stage that we don't see. And so when we think about that, and as I was thinking about that and how that really is the same with our lives, isn't it? That when it comes to every person you know, that there's always more going on that you can't see. And just like in a Broadway musical, when there's way more going on backstage that you can't see than you can see on the stage, it's also true for every single person that you and I know. That there is way more going on in their life that you can't see than there is that you can see. You see, when we see somebody, we can't see their past, really. Right? You definitely can't see what they're thinking. You can't tell if they've had a fight with their spouse that morning before they went to work, or if they got into an argument with somebody, or if they stubbed their toe and now it's just hurting and painful all day. We can't see all of that. And the reason that I'm starting us off in this episode today with this, there's three reasons. The first of all is that I think that you and I, we need to have more compassion for people in general. We need to have more compassion for people. Because sometimes people do foolish things. And we think that they have no good reason for doing it. And maybe they do, but they just can't talk about it. And if you and I would just decide just to not take about 80% of what other people do personally, it would sure go a long way to make us all happier. The second thing is that there is more going on in and around us that we can't see than there is that we can see. This is one of the reasons why we don't understand why we do the things that we do. And really, even if we did see it, we probably still wouldn't understand it. The third reason I want to start off with this is because we're in this series called Facing Your Giants, and this is the place where we meet David in this situation where there's more that he can't see that he can see. And I want us to look, as we start off today, with two verses from Scripture that come from two different places in the Scriptures, but they describe the same event, but they describe it from two different perspectives. So if you have your Bibles and you want to follow along with me, the first description is found in the book of 2 Samuel in chapter 24. And listen to how this event is described. Once again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he, the Lord, caused David to harm them by taking a census. Go and count the people of Israel and Judah, the Lord told him. Okay, now here's the same event in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Satan rose up against Israel and caused David to take a census of the people of Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the army, take a census of all the people of Israel, from Beersheba in the south to Dan in the north, and bring me a report so I may know how many there are. Same event, two different people describing it, two different perspectives. So which one of those is right? The answer? Both. Both of them are right. See, one of the things that we find when we read through scriptures, we learn that because of who God is, it's impossible for God to sin. He's not tempted by sin, and he doesn't tempt other people by sin. James, who was the brother of Jesus, who ended up becoming like the head of the home church in Jerusalem, he would write this. Listen to what he says. He says, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So when we look at this event, what really happened then? Well, the scriptures give us several clues about how this happens, but I'll give you two. First, there was a man who lived long before this, a man named Job. And in the scriptures, we read that Satan went to heaven and accused Job of only honoring God because God blessed him and protected him. Because God had blessed him with lots of money and lots of stuff and a huge family. So God says, I'll prove it to you. And he gives permission to Satan to take all of those things away. But Satan wasn't allowed to kill Job. And so Satan rids Job of his wealth. Satan kills his kids and eventually takes his health. But Job refused to sin by blaming God. Here's another clue. Hundreds of years after David, there was another king, and his name was Hezekiah. And like David, Hezekiah honored God with his life. But then this happened, and this is found in 2 Chronicles 32. Listen, when ambassadors arrived from Babylon to ask about the remarkable events that had taken place in the land, God withdrew from Hezekiah in order to test him and to see what was really in his heart. And when you go and read that whole story, what you learn is that Hezekiah didn't pass the test. Here's my point. There's more going on that you can't see behind the scenes than there is what is going on that you can see. See, Job didn't know that he was being tested. Hezekiah didn't know that he was being tested. And David didn't know that he was being tested either. God was moving in the backstage. God was moving behind the scenes, and none of them was aware of it at the time. So let's see what happened with David and the giant of insecurity that David faced and lost to. And the reason he lost to it is this, is that because nobody wants to feel weak, so we all look for ways to make ourselves look and feel stronger than we really are. And that's really not something that comes as a surprise to us, is it? Nobody wants to look weak or be thought of as weak or feel weak. So what we do is we look for ways to feel stronger in our own minds. We look for ways to make ourselves stronger or look stronger than we really are. And so when we look at our lives, there's so many ways we do this, and we do this in so many different areas of our life. We do this in sports, we do this with relationships, we do this in business, at our places of work. There's a lot of people even do that when they're serving at church. David fell for the trap of insecurity, as many of us have also. Listen to what happens. So the king said to Joab and the commanders of the army, "Take a census of all the tribes of Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, so I may know how many people there are." But Joab replied to the king, "May the Lord your God let you live to see 100 times as many people as there are now." "But why, my lord king, do you want to do this?" But the king insisted that they take the census. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out to count the people of Israel. Having gone through the entire land for 9 months and 20 days, they returned to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of people to the king. There were 800,000 capable warriors in Israel who could handle a sword, and 500,000 in Judah. Now, first of all, the problem wasn't that David took the census. The census wasn't what got David into trouble. You see, the census that David was taking was a military census. He asked Joab, who was his general, commanding general, to be the one to take the census. And this census was clearly for military purposes. That's why he puts General Joab in charge of it. David wanted the census because he wanted to see how big his army really was. And we see that Joab, who really wasn't a follower of God either, he didn't think that this was a great idea either. Now, we might look at this and say, oh, that's just being a smart leader, right? A smart leader wants to know, how many people does he have? What are his resources? I mean, he's the commander-in-chief of his armies. He should know how many troops he has available. And that really makes sense to us. But that's not what God and David had agreed to. God had promised David that he would fight for Israel, no matter how many troops David had. David was taking a military census because David wanted a plan B. David wanted a backup plan just in case God didn't come through for him. See, trusting in what we have instead of what God has promised is always a bad decision. This is why we don't do what we know we should do. Because when it comes down to it, we're not really 100% certain that God is really on our side. And so we think things like, I know I shouldn't live with my boyfriend, but I'm afraid that he won't marry me if I don't. We think things like, I know that I should tithe, I know that I should give to God, but I'm afraid that if I do, I won't have enough left over for me. We think, I know I should take at least one day off a week. But if I take one day off a week every week, I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to get everything done that I need to do in 7 days in those 6 days. We all have different reasons, but they all come down to one thing. We're afraid that we can't really trust God. And so we have to act in our own best interest. That's why it was wrong for David to take the census. Because what David was really saying to God when he took that census is he was saying, God, I don't trust you. Here's the point. Your real strength comes from who God is and not what you can do. That's where your real strength comes from. Listen, you are stronger than you think you are, but you are not the reason that you are stronger than you think you are. You are not the source of that strength. When you make the decision to put your faith and trust in Jesus, the Apostle Paul would write that in one of the letters that he wrote to the early Jesus followers in the city of Corinth. Paul would say that we have that strength because God's Spirit lives in me. God's Spirit lives in you. Paul says that the same power that said the words light exist, light be, and from that moment that those words were spoken, light started shooting out into the galaxy at 186,000 miles per second and hasn't stopped yet. That same power that did that is in you, and it's in me. You are stronger than you think you are. But the real strength doesn't come from from you. It comes from God in you. It comes from who God is and not what you can do. Now, here's the deal. When you believe that, when you really believe that, you'll worship. When you don't, you worry. When you really believe that your true strength comes from who God is in you, then the natural response is to give God the credit for all the good things in your life. You intentionally and verbally tell God how great he is. And do you know what that is when we do that? When we tell God how great he is, we call that worship. Now here's what happens next. David goes to the Lord and he confesses his mistake to the Lord. He confesses that he didn't trust God, and that's why he took the census. And then God sends the prophet, a man named Gad, with 3 choices for David's discipline. And so God sends a plague that kills about 70,000 Israelites in 3 days. Now, in this plague, which was the price that David had to pay for his not trusting God, during that plague, there was a moment when the angel of death was approaching Jerusalem. And God appears and tells the angel to stop. And the angel was there, and he was about to kill a man named Araunah. And Araunah was threshing wheat on the threshing floor. Now, a threshing floor is just a hard surface, a flat surface that is used to bash the wheat to separate the wheat from the chaff. And this is a picture of an actual threshing floor in Santorini, Greece. And so this is kind of what it looked like. And Araunah was there, and he was threshing the wheat. And it was on that threshing floor that God appeared and rescued his people from total destruction. This is how it's recorded. That day Gad came to David and said to him, "Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." In other words, the prophet was saying to David, listen, it is time for you to build something, a place of worship on that place where God saved your people. So David went up to do what the Lord had commanded him. Do you know what you do at an altar? You worship. David was building a place to worship God. He was building an altar, and building that altar altered David. It changed him. And one of the things David knew was that there's no shortcut in worshiping God. You give him your very best. When God tells you to build an altar, you don't take shortcuts. You don't cut corners. You give God your very best. See, God could have let that angel of death destroy all of Israel, including David, but he didn't. He spared David. He spared David's family. He spared David's entire nation. And so how do we respond when God does that for us? How do we respond when God saves us? How do we respond when God looks at us and realizes that there is no way that you and I on our own could ever make it, could ever restore that connection with him? And so what God does out of his love for us is he sends his only son to come into the world, to live a perfect life, to die a death that he didn't deserve, just so he could pay the ransom for your life and for mine. What do we do? How do we respond to a God who does that? We worship. We give him our very best. Look at what happens next. It says, when Araunah saw the king and his men coming toward him, he came and bowed before the king with his face to the ground. "Why have you come, my lord the king?" Araunah asked. David replied, "I have come to buy your threshing floor and to build an altar to the Lord there, so that he will stop the plague." "Take it, my lord the king, and use it as you wish," Araunah said to David. "Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and you can use the threshing board and ox yokes for wood to build a fire on the altar. I will give it all to you, your majesty. May the Lord your God accept your sacrifice." Now, whoa, that was a deal. David came to buy the threshing floor, to buy the real estate. And not only does Araunah offer to give him the real estate, but he's also going to give him all of the things that he needs to build the altar. Now, that was tempting for David. It was tempting for him to just say, okay, yeah, this, it's all set. I can do this. But you see, for David, it was a test. See, David had become a taker. David took Bathsheba. David took Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. He took his life. David took the census. He did these things because he thought he was doing what was best for him. And now Araunah was offering David the opportunity to take more, to continue to take. But look at how David responds to this test. But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on buying it. For I will not present burnt offerings to the Lord my God that have cost me nothing. See, when you decide to give God your very best, when you recognize that he has only ever given you his very best, you know that it's going to cost you. You want it to cost you something. See, there are no shortcuts in giving God your best. And in the same way that building that altar altered David, when you give God your best, it's going to change you too. Giving God your best will change you. It will change your attitude towards your stuff. It will change how you look at other people. It will change you. And when you do that, when you give God your best and it changes you, it changes your family. How your spouse responds to you will change. How your children respond to you will change. How your parents respond to you will change. And that will change them. And when you change and your family changes, you realize that giving God your very best will change the world. It will change your desires. It will change the things that are important to you. You're going to want to go out and to make your neighborhood, your community, your city, your country, your nation, your world better. Now, this is not an overstatement. When you give God your very best, it really can change the world. This is a picture of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It's one of the most important places in the entire world. In fact, the three largest religious groups in the world, the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians, all believe that the temple site is an incredibly important, incredibly holy place. Because that was the place where God would appear to his people. Now, David would later have a son, and his son Solomon was about to build the first temple in Israel. And it's recorded this way. It says, so Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father. Now listen to this. The temple was built on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. That temple that you saw, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, is the place where Araunah's threshing floor was. It was in that place that temple site sits today. The same place where God appeared to David. The place where God saved David, his family, and his nation. The place where God told David to build an altar. That place that changed David so much. That place that changed Solomon so much. That changed the entire world. That place was built where Solomon built the first temple. So you can't tell me that God can't use you to change the world. God took David, who was a shepherd boy, and turned him into a king. And despite all of David's failures, he did it because David was willing to give God his very best. And now, 3,000 years later, we're still talking about him. God used David, and God can use you. God can use you. God can use our church to change us. God can use our church to change our families, and God can use our church to change this community, and yes, even to change the world. But we have to be willing to give God our very best, because that's all that God has ever given us. And so today, as we come to the beginning of fall and the end of September, October is next week, and then the slow ride down into the holidays and the end of the year, today I want to announce Gracepoint's special annual Christmas offering. The Christmas offering this year is a year-end giving initiative that focuses on expanding our reach to people who need Jesus. And so on December 17th, we will receive a special offering to raise $30,000. That $30,000 we raise will fund two primary objectives. The first one is that we're going to resource the Second Harvest Food Bank and its local affiliates to feed many needy families in our community. And the second objective is to hire a dedicated children's director to better care for our kids. Now, I want you to imagine for just a moment the relief, that South City and beyond, the families that live in our area, are going to feel when they can go to the food bank and go home with fresh fruits and vegetables, with groceries, because we were able to help resupply and support the food bank after what's going to be a very busy holiday season. Imagine for a moment how much more we're going to be able to do here at Gracepoint for the children and families, not just in our church, but for those living in our city and beyond. Because we're going to have someone who is thinking and working and dedicated as our children's director. We've been talking about this, we'll be talking about this a lot more over the next several weeks, and you'll be receiving more information over the next several weeks, but this is an opportunity for us as a church to step up. We need to do our very best because God deserves it and because our church and our community absolutely needs it.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.